About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he could not find a scientific explanation for. So with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
Well, this is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness studies, cybernetics, and anthropology, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research and explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer questions that you have sent to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. Now, if you've been listening to this show, you know that normally in the world of medicine and psychology, consciousness is being awake and aware, knowing what's going on around us. In the field of noetics, though, consciousness is much more. It's the processes and products of mind, both in our awareness and outside of it. It's profound human experience that shapes our lives. And ultimately, consciousness is what connects us all. And so far in this series, we've looked at a number of models of what consciousness and mind is. We started at the beginning of the scientific exploration with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and their ideas from the early 20th century. Then into the mid-century with Charles Tart's 1960s descriptions of the various states of consciousness that we experience over the course of a day or a lifetime. And then Julian Jaynes, who related consciousness to the separation of right and left hemispheres of our brain, saying that we sometimes hear things from the right brain that we think are from outside of us. We looked at some of the field models of mind that have been developed by Rupert Sheldrake, Kurt Levine, and others who are trying to explain how it is that mind affects and is affected by the body and other things faster than nerve signals can travel. Then we began to understand and consider how quantum mechanics relates to consciousness with the work of David Bohm, Dana Zohar, and Amit Goswami. We looked at the global brain, or noosphere, as described by Peter Russell, Teilhard de Chardin, and Ervin Laszlo. And we explored the field of transpersonal psychology, which was founded in the 1970s to apply some of these newer understandings in both therapy and research. We then looked at the work of Bruce Lipton and Candace Pert, who described how hormones act as molecules of emotion and lead to a biology of belief. We've explored some of the experimental results supporting these new ideas about consciousness, looking at the Global Consciousness Project and how it is ongoingly mapping humanity's responses to major events through what computers are showing on their printouts. And presentiment, the sense of being stared at, demonstrating that the body responds and the mind seems to be aware several seconds before the eyes and ears actually perceive and send the signal to the brain. And last week, we focused on what is increasingly called coherence, that state of consciousness in which the heart, the mind, and the emotions are all in alignment. You can catch up on those past shows on the KXCR.net archives. Go to the KXCR.net website and then click on that little cloud that's up on the banner at the top of the screen. You can also find them on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips, the books, and the authors that I mention. This week, we're looking at the experiments that support the many anecdotal experiences of telepathic communication. Now, I know that sounds way outside of science, and there are many materialist scientists who would agree with you, but it makes sense, really, if you consider the models that we've been reviewing this last week. If mind is not limited to the brain or even by it, but is actually a field that includes and surrounds the brain and the body, then when fields overlap, their minds, the multiple minds of the fields, might be shared. And the quantum experience of entanglement suggests that once fields have overlapped, they are always connected. So what's going on in the mind of someone we've been close to might well be perceivable in our minds. And this is exactly what a number of experiments demonstrate. Now, in these experiments, two people are placed in separate, isolated rooms, and one is given a randomly selected image to focus on, while the other, in a deeply relaxed state of consciousness, reports what is being perceived, and then afterward chooses which image that person believes was being projected. The experiment was designed in the 1970s when researchers were beginning to understand that not only were different states of consciousness happening, but we can choose what state we wish to be in, and there are tools to assist us in getting there. It was the beginning of the era of guided meditations, and it uses both light and sound to help the receiver enter a receptive state of consciousness. Over the 40-plus years that these experiments have been performed, most of them have had results well beyond chance. Now, there are lots of criticisms of these experiments. Skeptics, materialist scientists have complained that images weren't exactly random or that the experimenter and the sender were able to hear each other, and some even claim that the experimenters have deliberately modified their results. Nonetheless, one assessment of 108 different studies involving almost 4,000 participants from different countries in many different labs came up with an analysis of their overall results that were 1,000,000,000 to 1 against chance. Now, you can read the details of this experiment and this analysis in Dean Radin's book, Supernormal, which I'll talk more about in the review section of this show. You may have actually experienced something that felt like telepathy. You're with someone and you both come up with the same thought or the same word at the same time. Or someone starts to describe something and you can see it clearly in your own mind. There are thousands of anecdotal stories of telepathy, especially with long-term married couples and with twins, as is explored on the TV show we'll listen to a few moments of now.
Naked Science will attempt to monitor the twins for signs of telepathic communication. First, the boys will be widely separated to avoid physical communication. Then Damien will be subjected to a series of stimuli to see if his twin reacts.
Polygraph now.
Richard is connected to a polygraph machine by Guy Heseltine, a member of the American Polygraph Association. A polygraph detects physiological changes to the body that are invisible to the eye, but can be charted from moment to moment.
Okay, this one's going to go around your stomach.
Separate belts at the top and bottom of the chest record changes in breathing. Results appear on the two blue lines at the top of the computer screen. Electrodes measure electrical conductivity across the surface of the skin, recorded in green on the computer screen. An armband measures pulse rate and also records any changes in blood pressure, the red line on the screen. Finally, Richard wears headphones to ensure that he doesn't hear what's taking place in the house during the trial. Downstairs, Damien concentrates on his absent twin by drawing his picture.
I'll draw him kicking the football.
He's a bit bored at the moment, isn't he?
Yes. Why did you do that for?
First, Damien is startled. Is it possible his reaction will trigger a reaction in his twin?
Just after the plates were dropped, it appears that there's an increase in the cardio activity, followed very closely by an increase in the skin resistance, which could well be significant.
Upstairs, Richard relaxes as Damien takes a second test.
I'm going to put your hand in this jar.
Blindfolded, he tries to find candy in a jar. He discovers to his shock that the bottom of the jar holds nothing but ice-cold water.
Right in.
Oh, it's gone.
Richard appears unaffected. But moments later, the polygraph chart reveals him taking a deep breath. Blood pressure and pulse also show a sudden change.
It was.
During the test, the child here was caused to have quite a significant movement, also in line with a deep breath, which may well be significant to what was going on downstairs.
Finally, Damien is startled by a balloon being burst. And the polygraph records changes in twin Richard's vital signs.
Over all three experiments, there's some kind of reaction that the child has experienced up here on each of the three tests. It could be construed that those reactions are as a result of some kind of activity downstairs.
So the twins appear to be connected. One twin feels in the body a reaction to what the other twin is actually experiencing. The mom has a bunch of anecdotal stories around these two twins, that when one has a kidney problem, the other one has a backache. When one has a knee problem, the other one has a knee ache, and so on. So these two seem to be pretty tightly connected. There are many other twin studies being done, and some of them are showing some pretty interesting results, and others are, well, maybe questionable if, you could say they're based on identical genes, growing up in the same household, etc. But this kind of test is going on all over the world by people at all levels of research skills, and we will see in the years to come how well they can be accepted in the scientific world. Now, what might be happening here? If, in fact, one twin is able to feel what the other twin is experiencing, we could well be looking at quantum entanglement, that the body-mind system of both twins have been in a mind field, a field that is their mind, and their mind has overlapped from the womb all the way through their lives in such a way that they experience things almost in tandem. Quantum entanglement would explain that to some extent, especially as we see more and more that the brain functions as a quantum system. So the twin research is helping us to understand this whole concept of telepathy, because it turns out that there is more direct data relating to body reaction than to mental reaction. Experiments I described earlier are people in two separate rooms. One is sending an image, another one is receiving it. We saw in the book, The Psychic Discoveries Beyond the Iron Curtain, that people were doing that kind of research at long distances back in the 70s. But one of the things that wasn't talked about in the Gansfeld experiments is the role of emotion in this. And it is talked about in the book, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. And that is when the image has a strong emotion attached to it, then it is more likely to be received. And in fact, a lot of the twin stories, especially on this YouTube that I was sharing these experiments with you from, are about those kinds of events. Where there is an intense emotion, the other twin picks it up, even if she's sound asleep. Where it's just an intellectual process, for example, taking an exam and there isn't hardly any pressure on it, then the overlap is somewhat reduced, if at all significant. So the emotions are a big part of it. And the sense, the body sense, is a big part of it. Now, last week we talked about coherence and the importance of the heart in the system, that when the mind and the heart are in coherence, then there is greater vitality, strength, and effectiveness in the overall body-mind system. And that is related, I think, to what we're seeing today in these twins experiments. We're seeing that the body picks it up first. Similarly, when we were looking at the presentiment experiments, the premonition experiments, the realization that the body picks it up even when the conscious awareness is not involved, isn't even connected to what's going on. So we're looking at a whole system, surprise, surprise, a whole body-mind system that cannot be separated. And telepathy appears to be something that happens between bodies and then may or may not move into the sphere of conscious awareness. Fascinating stuff, isn't it? So we'll talk more about these and other things when we look at the book we're going to be studying here on Noetic Moments at KXCR.org. So the book I want to look at today is Dean Radin's book, Supernormal. The subtitle is Science, Yoga, and the Evidence for Extraordinary Psychic Abilities. Now, what Dean did with this book is really very interesting. He took the basic text for meditation and the yogic sciences that was written somewhere between 600 and 1600 by a man known as Patanjali. The English translation is usually Christopher Isherwood's How to Know God, written with Swami Vivekananda. But my favorite one was written by Archibald Bahm, who was a philosophy professor at the University of New Mexico, where I studied anthropology. Now, Patanjali's yoga aphorisms say that if one practices yoga intensely and regularly, some abilities will start to happen. They'll happen automatically. You don't have to focus on them. And in fact, he says, don't focus on them. They'll distract you. The term for these abilities is siddhis, S-I-D-D-H-I, siddhi. And they have a dual meaning. They have a meaning of power and of distraction. What Radin did in the book Supernormal was go through each of the siddhis to see what scientific experiments support whether they're real or not, whether they can happen or not. And one of them was telepathy, and I referred to some of that earlier. But there are several other siddhis. Precognition, we've already talked about, being aware of something in the body or being aware of something even in the mind prior to its actual perception. And then telepathy, which we talked about today. But he also talks about psychokinesis in living systems and psychokinesis in inanimate systems, clairvoyance, and then he talks about the relationship between psi and meditation. So what Radin is telling us is that the yogis have understood many of these phenomena for thousands of years before we did, and that the phenomena appear to be scientifically verifiable, and that the Gansfeld approach of putting the receiver into a state of consciousness where the thoughts are no longer running the brain, but it is peaceful and receptive, is part of the process. Well, that sound tells me we need to look at what's going on in the world today and what you, the listeners, are curious about. The Gansfeld telepathy experiments are based on the assumption that the mind has states of consciousness that are more or less receptive to the thoughts of those our minds are entangled with, right? They induce a particular state, which is very similar to the pre-sleep state known as hypnagogic. So I'm going to talk a little more about that today. In that state, the brain has literally let go of its search for input and has shut down most of the inner narrative that it uses to organize our perceptions. Now, what do I mean by that? Imagine waking up without a narrative to describe what you're perceiving. You open your eyes, wall, window, curtain, floor, rug, door, tile, sink. Our narrative tells us how these bits of data are connected and what meaning they have for us. We're constantly telling ourselves what is happening around us and inside us. In this case, that we are waking up in our bedroom or somewhere else. And I have to say, as a frequent traveler, I'm very familiar with the need to shift my narrative when I wake up in some hotel room or guest room somewhere. Well, when we're in the state of consciousness that the Gansfeld experiments induce, this narrative has nothing to focus on. It's like when we're about to go to sleep as we shut down the voices that have been going on in our heads all day and close our eyes in a dark space and begin to just relax into beingness instead of doingness. And that's probably why many stories of paranormal experiences happen during that between state that's just before or after sleep, the hypnagogic state of consciousness. If we really want to develop our capacities beyond our normal five senses, then clearly we need to learn how to access that state of consciousness. A few weeks back, I talked about contemplation and reverie as very encouraging and helpful for the body and mind. Now I'm going to take it the next step. How can we begin to turn off this inner dialogue, this inner narrative that is constantly telling us what's happening? Now, in the meditation literature, there are lots of ways, and if you have been part of, say, a Vipassana retreat or even in a sweat lodge, you may have had some experiences on having this narrative shut down and discover what's going on behind it. If you haven't had that kind of guidance, let me give you a quick technique that you may be able to use. This is the basic meditation technique taught to Tibetan students long before they become lamas, when they're just beginning to shift from being boys who are playing outside to being meditators. And what they're taught to do is to find a comfortable, relaxed position. For them, because they grew up in a world that doesn't have chairs and they're used to squatting or sitting, they will go into something that we call the Lotus Posture. That is, they will sit with their legs brought up and interlaced so that the body is in a stable, relaxed state. Their backs will be relatively straight, and they will relax into the center of their being. And then they are invited to take 3 long, slow breaths. Each breath brings them a little more relaxed, a little more centered in their being. And after the 3rd breath, they're invited to observe their regular breathing for a standard Tibetan cycle, a standard Buddhist cycle, which happens to be very close to 21. So 21 breaths are counted just as a regular breathing. And by the end of the 21 breaths, the narrative has usually stopped. And the meditator, or the person learning how to meditate, can relax into a state of mindfulness, which is to say, they are no longer paying attention to the narrative going on in their brains, in their minds, but they are aware of simply being, with no sense of doing, just being, which is very close to the state we're in just prior to going to sleep. You give it a try sometime. I think you'll be impressed. And if you proceed to do this on a daily basis for half an hour or so, once or twice a day, you may find that some of these siddhis that Patanjali describes in the yoga aphorisms of Patanjali actually begin to become part of your world and life. Won't that be fun? Well, that's it for today's show. The next time we get together, we'll look at some more of these experiments, more of the research and being done in an attempt to understand what this thing we're calling consciousness is and what it really does. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there's a list of the titles and other resources we refer to on the show, along with archived past shows, and where you can send me your comments and questions, which I'll do my best to answer the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments at KXCR Community Radio, 90.7 FM in Florence, Oregon. And have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.